331 BCE. The dust clouds rising from the plain of Gaugamela stretched to the horizon. King Darius III of Persia, seated on his elevated chariot at the centre of the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world, watched the Macedonian forces deploy across from him. His advisors had assured him that numbers would prevail. 1 million men, they claimed, though modern historians estimate closer to 100,000. Still, it was an overwhelming force. Cavalry from every corner of the empire, scythed chariots designed to tear through infantry, war elephants that had never been defeated, Greek mercenaries who understood Macedonian tactics, the finest archers in Asia. Against this, Alexander brought perhaps 47,000 men. The Persian king allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This upstart Macedonian who had dared invade his empire would finally be crushed under the weight of Persian might. What Darius didn't know, what none of his generals standing in that enormous host could have imagined, was that within hours his army would be shattered, his empire would begin its collapse, and the cavalry charge he was about to witness would become the most studied tactical maneuver in military history. The Battle of Gaugamela would demonstrate how 5,000 horsemen, properly led and perfectly timed, could destroy an army 20 times their size. This is the story of how Alexander the Great's Companion Cavalry broke the Persian centre in seconds and changed warfare forever. Alexander the Great was 25 years old at Gaugamela, but he was already a veteran of countless battles. Born in 356 BCE in Pella, capital of Macedon, he had been trained from childhood by his father Philip II in the art of war. Philip had revolutionized Macedonian warfare, creating the sarissa-armed phalanx and developing combined arms tactics that made Macedon the dominant power in Greece. But Alexander would take his father's innovations and perfect them into something unprecedented. The Companion Cavalry, Alexander's elite striking force, were drawn from Macedonian nobility. These were not mere horsemen. They were aristocrats who had trained together since childhood, who could afford the best armour and horses, who fought not for pay but for glory and their king. Each man provided his own equipment: a Thessalian horse bred for size and aggression, a ziston, the cavalry lance nearly 12 feet long, a kopis, the curved slashing sword, body armour of bronze or iron scales, a helmet, usually Boeotian style, offering good visibility and protection. No shields. The companions fought with both hands on their weapons, relying on armour, skill, and the speed of their charge for protection. The formation itself was unique. While most cavalry of the ancient world fought in lines, the companions were organised in wedge formations, with Alexander typically leading from the tip. This wasn't ceremonial. The wedge allowed maximum force concentration at the point of impact while maintaining manoeuvrability. The lead rider, usually Alexander himself, would strike first, with each subsequent rank adding momentum and widening the breach. It was a human battering ram on horseback, designed to punch through enemy formations and create chaos. By the time of Gaugamela, these men had fought together for years. They had charged Persian cavalry at the Granicus River. They had broken through Greek mercenary lines at Issus. They knew Alexander's signals, understood his tactics, and most importantly, they trusted him completely. That trust would be critical because what Alexander was about to ask them to do defied every conventional military wisdom of the ancient world. The plain of Gaugamela, near modern-day Mosul in Iraq, had been chosen by Darius specifically to favour his forces. He had even ordered the ground levelled and smoothed to give his scythed chariots maximum effectiveness. The Persian army deployed at dawn on October 1st, 331 BCE. The formation was massive, stretching for miles across the plain. On the Persian right wing, Bessus commanded Bactrian and Scythian cavalry, the finest horsemen in the empire. These were warriors who had grown up on horseback, who could shoot arrows at full gallop, who knew no fear in mounted combat. The centre held the Greek mercenaries, professional hoplites who had fought against Macedon before and understood Macedonian tactics. Behind them stood the Immortals, the Persian royal guard 10,000 strong. Darius himself commanded from here, mounted on his distinctive royal chariot. On the left wing, more cavalry units from across the empire: Armenians, Cappadocians, Syrians. In front of the entire army, 200 scythed chariots and 15 war elephants, creatures the Macedonians had never faced in battle. The Persian plan was straightforward: use the chariots to break up the Macedonian phalanx, send the cavalry wings around to envelop Alexander's smaller army, crush them through sheer weight of numbers. It was a sound plan. Against any other army it would have worked. Darius had made only one miscalculation. He was facing Alexander. The Macedonian deployment revealed Alexander's tactical genius. His phalanx formed the centre, but it was arranged at an angle, refused on the left. His second line was positioned not directly behind the first, but offset and mobile. Most critically, Alexander positioned himself and the Companion Cavalry on the right wing, opposite Bessus and the Bactrian Cavalry. His best troops against the enemy's best troops. But Alexander wasn't planning to fight a conventional cavalry battle. He was planning something that had never been attempted on such a scale. The battle began with the scythed chariots. These terrifying weapons with long blades extending from their axles and designed to mow through infantry like wheat, thundered toward the Macedonian lines. The sound alone was horrifying. Hundreds of horses at full gallop, wheels and blades creating an unholy screaming noise. Persian commanders watched, confidently. No infantry could stand against such an assault. But Alexander had prepared for this. As the chariots approached, the Macedonian light infantry, the Agrianians and archers, stepped forward and unleashed a devastating barrage. Arrows and javelins struck horses and drivers. The Macedonian phalanx, instead of standing firm, opened lanes. The surviving chariots, unable to stop their momentum, charged through the gaps, finding only empty ground. Behind the phalanx, Macedonian grooms and servants simply grabbed the reins of the now harmless chariots. In less than 5 minutes, the terrifying scythed chariot force was neutralized without killing a single Macedonian soldier. Enraged, Bessus ordered his Bactrian cavalry forward. This was the moment Darius had planned for. The cavalry would sweep around Alexander's right flank, attack from the rear, destroy the Macedonian army. Thousands of horsemen began their advance. And this is where Alexander's genius emerged. Instead of meeting the charge head-on, he ordered his entire right wing to move at an angle, marching diagonally away from the Persian centre. To Darius and his generals, it looked like Alexander was refusing battle, trying to extend his line to prevent encirclement. Bessus followed, committing more cavalry to pursue what appeared to be a retreating enemy. The Bactrians charged after Alexander's moving wing, drawing further and further from the Persian centre. What no one in the Persian army realized was that Alexander was creating exactly the situation he wanted. Every horseman Bessus sent to pursue Alexander's right wing was a horseman who wasn't protecting the Persian centre. Alexander was deliberately pulling Persian cavalry away from Darius, creating a gap. It was a move of breathtaking audacity. Against a less disciplined force, it would have resulted in disaster as cavalry attacked the exposed Macedonian flank. But Alexander knew his men could maintain formation while moving at an angle under pressure, and he was gambling that Darius would become impatient. On the Macedonian left, the situation was deteriorating. Persian and Indian cavalry had broken through and were attacking the baggage train. The second line of Macedonian infantry had to wheel around to face this threat. From Darius's position, it looked like the Macedonian army was coming apart. This was the moment to commit the centre, to send the Greek mercenaries and immortals forward to break the Macedonian phalanx. Darius gave the order, the Persian centre advanced, and in that moment, Darius made his fatal mistake. As his centre moved forward, a gap opened in his line. The advancing infantry created a space between themselves and the cavalry on the wings. It was inevitable. An army that size couldn't maintain perfect cohesion while advancing. Under most circumstances, it wouldn't matter. But Alexander had been waiting for exactly this moment. He saw the gap instantly. Later, ancient historians would debate whether Alexander had somehow foreseen this exact development, or whether he was simply a tactical genius who could recognize and exploit any opportunity instantly. The truth is probably both. Alexander had created the conditions that made the gap inevitable, and when it appeared, he reacted with devastating speed. He turned to his companion cavalry, the men who had trained with him since childhood, the aristocrats who had followed him across Asia, the horsemen who had never failed him. And he pointed his lance toward the gap in the Persian centre, toward Darius himself. The signal was given, and 5,000 men on horseback formed into their wedge formations and prepared to charge. What happened next unfolded with shocking speed. The Companion Cavalry, with Alexander at the tip of the lead wedge, launched into a gallop. Not a wild, uncontrolled charge, but a precisely timed, perfectly maintained formation that accelerated as it moved. The wedge formation allowed them to maintain cohesion even at high speed. The front rank of horsemen, with Alexander himself leading, struck the Persian line first. The physics of the impact were devastating. A horse at full gallop weighs over 1,000 pounds. Add an armoured rider with a 12-foot lance, and the kinetic energy was enormous. The companions hit the gap in the Persian line like a thunderbolt. The Greek mercenaries attempting to fill the space were still in loose formation, not prepared for the shock of heavy cavalry. Alexander's lance took the first man in the throat. The second man was trampled by his horse. Behind him, the companions poured through, each wedge formation driving deeper into the Persian centre. The Xiston lances were perfectly designed for this type of combat. Long enough to strike before enemy infantry could reach the horsemen, strong enough to punch through armour, but light enough to be wielded with one hand. When a lance broke or became embedded in an enemy, the companions drew their kopis swords and continued fighting. The curved blade was designed for slashing attacks from horseback, and at the speed they were moving, each strike carried enormous force. The effect on the Persian centre was catastrophic. The Greek mercenaries, professional soldiers who had faced Macedonian phalanxes before, had never experienced anything like this. Heavy cavalry wasn't supposed to charge directly into formed infantry. It was suicide. Except Alexander wasn't charging into formed infantry. He was exploiting the gap, striking where the Persian line was weakest, and moving so fast that the enemy couldn't react. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. Persian infantry on both sides of the charge saw the Companion Cavalry smashing through their lines, saw their comrades being cut down by riders who seemed to move with supernatural speed, and most critically saw these horsemen heading directly for Darius himself. Alexander wasn't trying to defeat the entire Persian army through this charge. That would have been impossible. He was doing something far more sophisticated. He was targeting the Persian command structure. Ancient armies lived or died by their command and control. If you killed or captured the enemy commander, the army would collapse. Alexander had recognized that in this enormous Persian host everything depended on Darius. The cavalry obeyed Darius. The infantry looked to Darius. The entire elaborate command structure relied on the king's presence and authority. Remove Darius and the whole army would fall apart. The companions drove deeper into the Persian centre, carving a path of destruction directly toward the royal chariot. The Immortals, the elite Persian royal guard, moved to intercept, but they were infantry, and infantry, no matter how well trained, couldn't stop heavy cavalry in the open field. The Immortals fought bravely, dying in place rather than retreating, but they couldn't halt the Macedonian advance. More companions poured through the gap. What had started as 5,000 horsemen became a torrent of cavalry and supporting infantry. Alexander's supporting units, the Thessalian cavalry and hyperspists, followed through the breach, widening it, preventing the Persians from closing the gap. The charge had become a controlled breakthrough, a surgical strike at the heart of the Persian army. Darius, from his elevated chariot, could see everything. He watched the Macedonian wedge formations smashing through his centre. He saw the Immortals being cut down. He saw Alexander himself, distinctive in his white-plumed helmet and gleaming armour, fighting at the front of the charge, getting closer with every second. The Persian king had experienced this before. At the Battle of Issus 2 years earlier, Alexander had charged directly at him, and Darius had fled. His generals had criticised him for cowardice, but Darius understood something his critics didn't. In Persian military tradition, the king was the empire. If the king died, everything died with him. Staying to fight Alexander personally might have been brave, but it would have been strategically stupid. If Darius fell, there would be no one to rally the army, no one to organise a retreat, no one to preserve what remained of Persian power. So Darius made the same decision he had made at Issus. He ordered his charioteer to turn and ride for safety. The moment the royal chariot began to move away from the battle, panic spread through the Persian centre like wildfire. If the king was fleeing, the battle was lost. The Greek mercenaries, professionals who understood military realities, began a fighting withdrawal. The Immortals, those who still lived, tried to cover the king's retreat. The cavalry wings, still engaged on the flanks, suddenly found themselves fighting for an army that no longer had a centre. The Persian formation began to dissolve, but Alexander didn't stop. This is what separated him from other commanders. many generals would have been satisfied with breaking the enemy centre and declaring victory. Alexander understood that a retreating enemy could regroup, could fight another day, could preserve enough forces to continue the war. He wanted total destruction. The Companion Cavalry pursued Darius with relentless intensity. They weren't trying to capture him anymore. They were trying to create such complete chaos in the Persian army that organised resistance became impossible, and it worked. As Darius fled, the Persian cavalry wings, realising their centre had collapsed, began to disengage. The Bactrian cavalry under Bessus, the finest horsemen in the empire, broke off their attack and began to retreat. Without coordination, without a unified command structure, the massive Persian army became a mob of individual units trying to escape. The Macedonian phalanx, which had held firm during the entire battle, now advanced. The sarissa, those 18-foot pikes, became instruments of slaughter as they pushed into the disorganised Persian infantry. The Thessalian cavalry, freed from defending the left flank, wheeled around and began pursuing the retreating Persians. What had been a battle became a rout. What had been an army became a refugee column. The pursuit continued for miles. Ancient sources claim that 40,000 Persians died at Gaugamela, though modern historians are sceptical of such numbers. But even if the actual casualties were a quarter of that, it was still a catastrophic defeat. More importantly, the Persian army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Units scattered across the empire. Officers fled to their home provinces. The command structure that had held the Persian Empire together for 2 centuries collapsed. Alexander's casualties were remarkably light. Ancient sources claim only 100 Macedonian dead, which seems impossibly low, but even if the real number was 10 times that, it represented a negligible loss rate. The Companion Cavalry, which had borne the brunt of the combat during the charge, lost perhaps 60 men. 60 men to break an empire. The charge itself, from the moment Alexander spotted the gap to the moment Darius fled, had lasted perhaps 15 minutes. In that quarter hour, the fate of Asia had been decided. The Persian Empire, which had stood for 200 years, which had conquered from Egypt to India, which had repelled Greek invasions and defeated the greatest armies of the ancient world, had been destroyed by a cavalry charge. The secret to Alexander's success wasn't just the charge itself, it was everything that led up to it. The years of training that allowed the Companion Cavalry to maintain formation at high speed. The combined arms tactics that pinned the Persian wings while creating the opportunity for the charge. The discipline of the Macedonian phalanx that held firm under pressure. The tactical flexibility that allowed Alexander to adjust his plans in real time, based on battlefield developments. Most critically, it was Alexander's ability to see the battlefield as a whole, to recognise the critical moment, and to commit his best troops at exactly the right time and place. The wedge formation itself deserves analysis because it represents a revolution in cavalry tactics. Before Alexander, cavalry typically fought in lines or loose formations. They would charge, engage in individual combat, and wheel away to regroup. The wedge changed everything. By concentrating force at a single point, the wedge could punch through enemy formations that would have stopped a linear charge. By maintaining formation during the charge, the companions could fight as a unit rather than as individuals. The lead riders absorbed the initial impact and created the breach. The following ranks exploited the breach and widened it. The formation was self-reinforcing. As long as forward momentum was maintained, the wedge was nearly unstoppable. The key was speed and shock. Heavy cavalry's greatest advantage was the terror and physical impact of the charge. A man on foot, even an armoured hoplite, couldn't stand against a horse moving at full speed. The psychological effect was enormous. Soldiers who would stand firm against charging infantry would break when faced with cavalry. The sound of hundreds of hooves, the sight of armoured horsemen with levelled lances, the knowledge that there was no way to stop them, it broke men's courage before the physical combat even began. Alexander understood this instinctively. The Companion Cavalry wasn't just a military unit. It was a psychological weapon designed to create panic in enemy formations. But the charge at Gaugamela also revealed the limitations of cavalry and why Alexander's success was so remarkable. Cavalry couldn't hold ground. Once the charge was complete, once momentum was lost, the horsemen became vulnerable. Infantry could surround them, pull them from their mounts, overwhelm them through numbers. This is why cavalry typically charged, engaged briefly, and withdrew to prepare another charge. Alexander couldn't do that. He was charging into the heart of an army of 100,000 men. If his cavalry stopped, if they lost momentum, they would be surrounded and destroyed. The only option was to keep moving, to maintain the charge all the way through the Persian centre and out the other side. It was all or nothing. Either they would break through completely or they would die. The fact that Alexander himself led the charge from the front wasn't just symbolic, it was tactically necessary. The Companion Cavalry would follow Alexander anywhere, but they needed to see him, needed to know he was sharing the risk. More importantly, Alexander was probably the best combat rider in his army. He had trained since childhood. He rode Bucephalus, a horse no one else could mount, a massive black stallion that was as much weapon as transportation. Alexander needed to be at the tip of the wedge because he was the man most likely to survive the initial impact and create the breach that would allow the others to follow. The lance work required for the charge was extraordinarily difficult. A ziston wasn't a light weapon. It was 12 feet of wood and iron, and it had to be controlled with one hand while riding at full gallop. The rider had to time his strike perfectly, aiming for gaps in enemy armour while avoiding entangling the lance in an enemy's body or equipment. A lance that became stuck was worse than useless because it could pull the rider from his horse. Experienced cavalry learned to strike and twist, using the horse's momentum to free the lance for the next target. When the lance broke or became unusable, the transition to the kopis sword had to be instantaneous. There was no time to fumble with weapons. At the speed of a cavalry charge, a second's hesitation meant death. The horses themselves were critical. The Salian horses, the breed preferred by the Companion Cavalry, were larger than typical ancient horses. They stood perhaps 15 hands high, about the size of a modern Arabian, but they were bred for aggression and stability. A warhorse had to be willing to charge into infantry formations, had to be trained not to shy away from spears and swords, had to maintain speed and direction even in combat. The training required years. Young horses were gradually exposed to the sounds and sights of battle. They learned to respond to leg pressure since the rider needed both hands for weapons. They were conditioned to bite and strike with their hooves, becoming weapons themselves. A fully trained warhorse was worth a fortune, and losing one was both an emotional and financial catastrophe. The aftermath of Gaugamela demonstrated why the charge had been so critical. With the Persian army shattered, Alexander was free to conquer the rest of the empire. Babylon opened its gates without resistance. Susa surrendered. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, was captured and burned. Darius himself fled east, trying to raise new armies, but he was eventually killed by his own nobles, who hoped to buy mercy from Alexander. By 330 BCE, just 1 year after Gaugamela, the Persian Empire had ceased to exist. All of this flowed directly from those 15 minutes when the Companion Cavalry broke the Persian centre. The charge at Gaugamela influenced military tactics for centuries. Roman cavalry studied Macedonian techniques. Medieval knights adopted similar wedge formations. Even modern armour tactics, using concentrated force to break through enemy lines, echo Alexander's principles. The concept of the decisive charge, committing your best troops at the critical moment to achieve breakthrough, became a fundamental principle of military strategy. But no one ever quite replicated Alexander's success because no one else had the combination of factors that made Gaugamela possible. No other commander had trained his cavalry to that level of precision. No other army had the discipline to execute such a complex maneuver under combat conditions. And no other general had Alexander's ability to read a battle, recognize the critical moment, and commit everything to a single decisive action. There's a tendency in modern analysis to focus on the tactical details and miss the broader truth. Alexander won at Gaugamela not because of a cavalry charge, but because he had spent his entire life preparing for that moment. He had been trained by Aristotle in strategy and philosophy. He had studied every battle his father Philip had fought. He had served as a cavalry commander at Cheronea when he was just 18. He had led men in combat for 7 years before Gaugamela. When he saw the gap in the Persian line, when he made the decision to charge, it wasn't impulse. It was the culmination of a lifetime of preparation, training, and experience. The men who followed him into that charge were equally prepared. These weren't peasant conscripts or mercenaries fighting for pay. They were Macedonian nobles who had trained together since childhood, who had fought beside Alexander in a dozen battles, who trusted him completely. When Alexander pointed his lance toward the Persian centre and began the charge, not one man hesitated. They knew the risks. They knew that charging into an army of 100,000 men was likely suicide, but they also knew that Alexander had never failed them, that his tactical genius had brought them victory after victory, that if he believed they could break the Persian line, then they could. That mutual trust between commander and soldiers was as much a weapon as their lances and swords. The charge at Gaugamela also revealed something about ancient warfare that modern observers often miss. Battles weren't won by the side that killed the most enemies, they were won by the side that broke the enemy's will to fight. The actual casualties at Gaugamela, while significant, represented a tiny fraction of the total forces engaged. The vast majority of the Persian army wasn't killed. They retreated, scattered, went home. They broke because their command structure collapsed, because their king fled, because they saw Macedonian cavalry smashing through their centre, and concluded that continuing to fight was pointless. The charge worked not because it physically destroyed the Persian army, but because it psychologically shattered it. This is why Alexander targeted Darius personally. He understood that killing 10,000 Persian soldiers wouldn't end the battle, but reaching Darius would. The entire Persian army was organised around the king's authority. Provincial governors fought because the king commanded it. Cavalry obeyed because they were loyal to the throne. Infantry stayed in formation because they believed in Persian imperial power. Remove the king, and all of that disappeared. It was psychological warfare at the highest level, using military force not to destroy the enemy, but to break his capacity for organised resistance. The speed of the Persian collapse after Darius fled proves how effective this strategy was. The Bactrian cavalry on the Persian right wing, which had been winning its engagement against Macedonian forces, immediately broke off and retreated when they learned the centre had collapsed. These were experienced warriors who could have continued fighting, but without Darius, without the command structure, there was no point. Similarly, the Persian left wing, which had actually broken through and was attacking the Macedonian baggage train, withdrew rather than pressing their advantage. In a modern army with clear chains of command and doctrine for independent action, units might have continued fighting even after losing contact with headquarters. But ancient armies lived and died by the presence of their commander. When Darius fled, the Persian army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, even though most of it was still physically capable of combat. The logistical aspects of the charge also deserve attention. Those 5,000 companion cavalry horses required food, water, and rest. Alexander's army had been marching for months to reach Gaugamela. The horses should have been exhausted, yet they were able to execute a high-speed charge that required peak performance. This was possible because of Macedonian logistical planning. Alexander's quartermasters had ensured adequate feed and rest stops. Veterinarians travelled with the army to treat injured and sick horses. Spare mounts were available. The seemingly simple act of charging required a massive support infrastructure that most ancient armies couldn't match. Persian cavalry, despite being more numerous, couldn't replicate the sustained high-speed charge because their logistics weren't as sophisticated. The weapons maintenance was equally critical. The Ziston lances were carefully crafted from specific types of wood, seasoned and treated to provide maximum strength at minimum weight. They were inspected regularly and replaced at the first sign of weakness. The Kopis swords were sharpened before every battle. The armour was repaired and maintained constantly. Ancient warfare required as much workshop labour as combat. For every man fighting at Gaugamela, there were probably 5 people supporting him, making sure his equipment was functional, his horse was healthy, his weapons were sharp. The Macedonian army excelled at this unglamorous but essential work, and it showed in battle when their equipment performed flawlessly under stress. The aftermath of the charge created its own challenges. The Companion Cavalry had penetrated deep into Persian territory, surrounded by enemies, with their own lines far behind. If Darius had rallied his forces immediately, if Persian commanders had organised a counterattack, the Companions could have been surrounded and destroyed. But Alexander had counted on the psychological shock being so severe that organised resistance would be impossible, and he was right. The Persian army was so demoralised by the speed and violence of the breakthrough that no one thought to counterattack. They thought only of escape. This psychological collapse was as important as the charge itself. Military historians often focus on Alexander's offensive brilliance and overlook his defensive genius. Throughout the battle, even while executing the charge, he maintained awareness of the overall situation. When his left wing was in trouble, he sent reinforcements. When the Persian cavalry broke through to the baggage train, he had prepared second-line forces to deal with them. The charge at the Persian centre wasn't a gamble that ignored everything else. It was part of a comprehensive battle plan that accounted for every contingency. Alexander could afford to commit the Companion Cavalry to the charge, because he had already ensured that the rest of his army could hold long enough for the charge to succeed. The training required to produce cavalry capable of the Gaugamela charge took years. Macedonian nobles began riding as children. By their teens, they were practicing formation riding, lance work and sword fighting from horseback. By their 20s, they had participated in campaigns and learned battlefield awareness. The men who charged at Gaugamela were in their prime, typically aged 25 to 35, at the peak of their physical abilities and experience. This level of training couldn't be replicated quickly. You couldn't take a group of random horsemen and turn them into companion cavalry in months or even years. It required a cultural tradition of horsemanship, wealth to afford proper equipment and mounts, and sustained military campaigning to develop combat skills. This is why no one could copy Alexander's success. By the time you had trained cavalry to that level, the strategic situation would have changed. The charge at Gaugamela also demonstrated the importance of combined arms warfare. The cavalry couldn't have succeeded without the phalanx holding the centre. The phalanx couldn't have advanced without the cavalry breaking the Persian command structure. The light infantry was essential for neutralizing the scythed chariots. The Thessalian cavalry protected the flanks. Every component of Alexander's army played a role in creating the conditions for victory. This integrated approach to warfare, where different troop types supported each other in executing a unified plan, was revolutionary in the ancient world and remained a key principle of military strategy for centuries. One aspect often overlooked is the role of intelligence and reconnaissance. Alexander knew the terrain at Gaugamela because his scouts had surveyed it thoroughly. He knew Darius's approximate troop strength and disposition because his intelligence network had infiltrated the Persian camp. He even knew about the scythed chariots in advance and had prepared countermeasures. The charge worked partly because Alexander had excellent information about what he was charging into. Attacking blindly into an unknown enemy formation would have been suicide. But Alexander knew where the Greek mercenaries were, positioned, where the gaps were likely to form, and where Darius would be stationed. This intelligence allowed him to plan the charge with precision rather than hoping for luck. The personal relationship between Alexander and his companions was also crucial. These weren't just soldiers serving a commander. They were friends, nobles who had grown up with Alexander, who had drunk with him, hunted with him, and fought beside him for years. When Alexander led a charge, they followed not just because he was their king, but because they trusted him personally. This bond of friendship and shared experience created a cohesion that formal military discipline alone couldn't achieve. The companions would literally die for Alexander because they believed he would die for them, and he proved it repeatedly by fighting at the front of every charge, sharing every risk. The impact of Gaugamela extended far beyond the immediate military victory. It demonstrated that the Persian Empire, which had seemed invincible, could be defeated. It inspired Alexander's army to continue the campaign deeper into Asia. It convinced Greek city-states that had been considering rebellion against Macedonian hegemony to remain loyal. It established Alexander as potentially the greatest military commander in history, all from 15 minutes of combat when cavalry broke an infantry line. The physics of the charge were brutal. A horse moving at 30 miles per hour carrying a 200-pound man in armour, striking a stationary infantry formation, generated enormous force. The impact broke bones, knocked men unconscious, created gaps in the formation. The lance strikes that followed were delivered with the full momentum of the charging horse behind them. A Ziston lance could punch through a bronze breastplate at that speed. The infantry couldn't absorb that much kinetic energy. They either got out of the way or were knocked down. And once men started falling, panic spread. Soldiers who might have stood firm against a frontal assault broke when they saw their comrades being trampled and run through. The wedge formation maximized this effect. The lead riders created the initial breach. The following ranks, each slightly wider than the one before, turned a narrow gap into a wide corridor. The pressure was constant, never giving the defenders time to regroup. It was like a knife cutting through cloth. The first cut created the opening. Continued pressure tore the cloth apart, The Persian infantry at Gaugamela experienced exactly this. They saw the first companions break through, then more and more cavalry poured through the gap, and the instinct to flee became overwhelming. The sound of the charge deserves mention because ancient writers emphasized it repeatedly. The thunder of thousands of hooves, the screaming of horses, the war cries of the riders, the clash of weapons and armor. It created a wall of noise that moved toward the enemy at 30 miles per hour. The psychological effect was immense. Modern studies of historical battles show that soldiers under stress fixate on sensory inputs. The sound of the charge became, in the minds of Persian infantry, the sound of death approaching. When you add the visual impact of armoured horsemen with levelled lances, the smoke and dust of the battlefield, and the knowledge that you were standing in the path of this juggernaut, the pressure to run became almost irresistible. Alexander's personal courage in leading the charge cannot be overstated. He wasn't directing from the rear. He was at the tip of the wedge, the first man to hit the Persian line, the primary target for every enemy soldier. He fought hand to hand, his armour was struck repeatedly, his horse was wounded multiple times in various battles. He shared every danger with his men, and they loved him for it. Modern military doctrine generally discourages commanders from exposing themselves to unnecessary risk, because the loss of command and control can be catastrophic. But in the ancient world, where battles were decided as much by morale as by tactics, Alexander's personal bravery was a force multiplier. His men fought harder, took greater risks, and endured more suffering because their king was right there with them. The aftermath of Gaugamela saw Alexander pursue Darius for hundreds of miles, trying to capture him and fully legitimize his claim to the Persian throne. The chase itself demonstrated the mobility and endurance of Macedonian cavalry. They could sustain pursuit for days, covering vast distances while maintaining combat readiness. Persian cavalry, despite their reputation, couldn't match this sustained operational tempo. The companions could fight a major battle, pursue the enemy for 50 miles, and still be ready for combat the next day. This operational endurance, as much as tactical skill, allowed Alexander to complete the destruction of Persian power. The legacy of the Gaugamela charge influenced military thinking for 2,000 years. Napoleon studied Alexander's campaigns and tried to replicate the decisive cavalry charge at Austerlitz. The German panzer tactics of World War II, using concentrated armour to break through enemy lines and drive deep into the rear, were explicitly modelled on Alexander's principles. The concept of the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point where you concentrate overwhelming force to achieve breakthrough, comes directly from Alexander's example. Modern combined arms doctrine, where different military branches support each other in executing a unified operational plan, descends from Macedonian practice. The charge at Gaugamela literally shaped how warfare would be conducted for millennia. What made Alexander's achievement even more remarkable was his age. He was 25 at Gaugamela. Most modern officers at that age are lieutenants or captains, commanding perhaps 100 men. Alexander commanded an army of 47,000, made strategic decisions that affected the future of entire civilizations, and executed tactical maneuvers of stunning complexity, all before his 26th birthday. His youth wasn't a liability, it was an advantage. He had the physical stamina to endure months of campaigning. He had the mental flexibility to adapt tactics in real time. He had the audacity to attempt maneuvers that older, more cautious commanders would never risk. And he had the energy to personally lead charges that would have exhausted men twice his age. The Companion Cavalry itself evolved after Gaugamela. Having proven their worth decisively, they became the model for elite cavalry across the Hellenistic world. After Alexander's death, his generals, the Diadochi, who carved up his empire, all tried to recreate companion-style cavalry units. But none quite succeeded. They could copy the equipment and formations, but they couldn't replicate the years of shared experience, the personal bonds, and the absolute trust that made the original companions so effective. Military capability isn't just about hardware and tactics, it's about people, relationships, and culture. The companions were products of Macedonian aristocratic culture, shaped by decades of Philip's military reforms and Alexander's charismatic leadership. You couldn't manufacture that artificially. The battle also revealed the limitations of numbers. Darius had brought an army many times larger than Alexander's, and it had accomplished nothing. In ancient warfare, as in modern, quality mattered more than quantity. A well-trained, well-led, properly equipped force of 47,000 men could defeat a poorly coordinated mass of 100,000. This lesson was repeatedly forgotten and relearned throughout military history. Size creates logistical challenges, command and control problems, and coordination difficulties. A smaller force with superior training, better equipment, and more competent leadership has inherent advantages. Alexander understood this instinctively. He never sought to match Persian numbers, he sought to maximize the effectiveness of the forces he had. The role of Alexander's officers during the charge is often overlooked. Clytus the Black, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Perdiccas. These men led their own wedge formations within the overall companion charge. They had to maintain cohesion, keep their men moving forward, and make split-second tactical decisions while fighting for their lives. The success of the charge depended on dozens of officers making correct decisions simultaneously under extreme stress. This speaks to the quality of Macedonian military education. These officers had been trained to think independently, to understand Alexander's intent and to execute without needing constant direction. Modern military doctrine calls this mission-type orders or Auftrags tactic, giving subordinates the objective and letting them determine how to achieve it. Alexander practiced this 2,000 years before it became formal doctrine. The treatment of the wounded after Gaugamela also reveals Macedonian military culture. Alexander personally visited wounded companions, remembered their names, knew their families. He ensured they received medical care, compensated those who were disabled, and honoured the dead with public ceremonies. This care for his men's welfare created fierce loyalty. Soldiers will fight hard for a commander who pays them. They will die for a commander who cares about them personally. Alexander understood this, and it made his army far more cohesive and motivated than typical mercenary forces. The medical care itself was surprisingly sophisticated. Alexander's army included physicians trained in the Greek tradition. They understood wound cleaning, amputation when necessary, and basic surgical procedures. Cavalry wounded at Gaugamela who received prompt treatment had reasonable survival rates for the ancient world. The Macedonian medical corps couldn't save everyone, but they could save enough that soldiers knew they wouldn't be abandoned if wounded. This knowledge affected battlefield behaviour. Soldiers fought more aggressively when they knew medical help was available. They took risks they might otherwise avoid. The companions' willingness to charge into the Persian centre was partly because they trusted that if they survived being wounded, they would be cared for. The horses that survived Gaugamela were veterans in their own right. A warhorse that had experienced the shock of combat, the noise, the blood, and the chaos was worth exponentially more than an untrained mount. These horses had learned not to panic, to respond to their riders' commands even under stress, to continue moving forward despite natural equine instincts to flee danger. Alexander's cavalry had an enormous advantage simply because their horses were combat veterans. Persian cavalry, even when better riders, often struggled because their mounts weren't as well trained for the specific demands of heavy cavalry combat. The strategic implications of Gaugamela were profound. With the Persian field army destroyed, Alexander could march wherever he wanted in the empire. Cities opened their gates rather than face siege. Provincial governors submitted rather than fight. The speed of the Persian collapse was partly military. Darius's army was gone, but mostly political. The empire had been held together by the king's authority and military power. Remove both, and the whole structure fell apart. Alexander didn't have to conquer every city and province individually. He just had to demonstrate that Persian power was broken. Gaugamela did exactly that. The financial implications were equally significant. Capturing the Persian treasury gave Alexander the resources to continue his campaigns, pay his troops, and reward loyalty. Ancient warfare was expensive. Soldiers expected regular pay. Equipment needed constant replacement. Supplies had to be purchased. Alexander's army was consuming enormous resources daily. The Persian gold captured after Gaugamela funded years of additional campaigning. Without that financial windfall, Alexander might have been forced to turn back, to consolidate his gains rather than pushing deeper into Asia. The charge at Gaugamela also demonstrated the importance of timing in warfare. Alexander could have charged earlier when the Persian army first deployed. He could have charged later, after more of his army was engaged. But he waited for exactly the right moment, when the Persian centre was advancing, when a gap had formed, when Darius was exposed. That patience, the ability to wait for the perfect moment despite the pressure of battle, separated great commanders from merely good ones. Many generals can devise a sound plan. Few can recognize the critical moment and execute decisively. The cultural impact of the battle was immense. Greeks and Macedonians, who had lived in fear of Persian power for generations, suddenly saw themselves as conquerors of Asia. The victory inspired Greek settlers to move east, spreading Hellenistic culture across the former Persian Empire. It created a fusion of Greek and Persian elements that shaped the region for centuries. The charge at Gaugamela didn't just change military boundaries, it changed civilization itself. Greek language, art, philosophy and culture spread across Asia, creating the Hellenistic world that would endure until the Roman conquest and beyond. The propaganda value was equally important. Alexander ensured that news of Gaugamela spread throughout the Greek world. Poets composed victory odes. Historians recorded the battle in detail. Artists created paintings and sculptures depicting the charge. The victory became legend even while Alexander lived. This carefully managed public relations campaign served multiple purposes. It intimidated potential enemies. It inspired wavering allies. It legitimized Alexander's claim to the Persian throne. And it ensured that his achievements would be remembered by history. Alexander understood that military victory wasn't enough. You had to control the narrative. The religious aspects of the campaign also mattered. Alexander portrayed himself as favoured by the gods. After Gaugamela, he sacrificed to Zeus and Athena, thanking them for victory. He consulted oracles, participated in religious ceremonies, and encouraged the belief that divine favour explained his success. Whether Alexander personally believed this or simply recognised its utility is debatable, but his soldiers believed it, and that belief made them more confident, more willing to take risks, more certain of ultimate victory. Religion in the ancient world wasn't separate from military affairs. It was integral to morale and motivation. The intelligence failure on the Persian side was catastrophic. Darius's scouts should have warned him about the gap forming in his centre. His officers should have recognised the danger when Alexander's cavalry shifted position. But Persian command and control was too centralised. Everything depended on Darius personally observing and directing. When Alexander's charge came from an unexpected direction at unexpected speed, the command system couldn't adapt fast enough. By the time Darius recognised the threat, the companions were already breaking through his line. This centralisation, often seen as a strength in peacetime when it ensured unified policy, became a fatal weakness in battle when rapid adaptation was necessary. The companions themselves suffered casualties during the charge, though ancient sources disagree on numbers. Some men fell to Persian spears, others were wounded by arrows, a few were pulled from their horses in close combat. But the casualties were light relative to the results achieved. This favourable loss ratio was partly due to speed. The faster the charge, the less time defenders had to inflict damage. It was also due to armour. Macedonian cavalry wore bronze or iron breastplates that could deflect glancing blows, and it was due to the shock effect. Persian infantry who might have fought effectively if given time to prepare were overwhelmed before they could organise effective resistance. The pursuit after the battle demonstrated another Companion Cavalry capability, sustained operations. After fighting the battle, they immediately pursued Darius, riding for hours without rest. This endurance was the result of excellent physical conditioning, both riders and horses. It was also testament to the quality of Macedonian logistics. Food and water were available during the pursuit. Spare horses allowed rotation. The companions could maintain operational tempo that other cavalry forces couldn't match. This allowed Alexander to keep pressure on retreating Persians, preventing them from regrouping and organising resistance. The psychological impact on survivors was long-lasting. Persian soldiers who survived Gaugamela spread stories of the invincible Macedonian cavalry throughout the empire. These stories grew with each telling. The companions became supernatural warriors in Persian imagination, capable of impossible feats. This psychological warfare was as effective as physical combat. Cities surrendered without fighting because they had heard what happened to those who resisted. Armies refused to engage because soldiers had heard stories from Gaugamela survivors. Alexander's reputation became a weapon in itself, defeating enemies before battle was joined. The charge also influenced how Alexander's subsequent battles were fought. At the Hydaspes River in India 4 years later, facing war elephants for the first time in a major battle, Alexander again used concentrated cavalry charges to break the enemy line. The tactics evolved, adapted to new enemies and terrain, but the fundamental principle remained. Find the critical point, concentrate superior force, strike decisively. This consistency of approach, refined through experience but fundamentally unchanged, characterized Alexander's entire military career. The companions themselves evolved as the campaign continued. By the time Alexander reached India, they were veterans of dozens of battles, experienced in fighting every type of enemy, from Greek hoplites to Persian cavalry to Indian elephants. This experience made them even more formidable. They could adapt to unexpected situations, improvise solutions to novel problems, and maintain cohesion under circumstances that would have shattered less experienced units. The men who charged at Gaugamela were excellent. The men who charged at Hydaspes 4 years later were unstoppable. The fate of individual companions after Gaugamela varied. Some died in subsequent battles, others retired wealthy and honoured. A few became generals themselves after Alexander's death, carving out kingdoms from his empire. But all of them, for the rest of their lives, defined themselves by that moment when they charged with Alexander into the heart of the Persian army. It became the central experience of their existence, the achievement against which everything else was measured. Veterans would gather decades later and still talk about the charge, still debate who had struck the first blow, still mourn friends who fell. The impact on Persian military culture was equally profound. After Gaugamela, Persian nobles questioned fundamental assumptions about warfare. If the largest army in the world couldn't defeat 47,000 Macedonians, what good were traditional Persian tactics? Some Persians joined Alexander's army, seeking to learn Macedonian methods. Others tried to reform Persian military practice, adopting Greek-style phalanx formations and cavalry tactics. But it was too late. The Persian Empire was finished, and with it went the military tradition that had dominated the Middle East for 2 centuries. The economic impact of Alexander's victory rippled throughout the ancient world. Trade routes that had been controlled by Persians now opened to Greek merchants. Gold and silver captured from Persian treasuries flooded into circulation, affecting prices and wages across the Mediterranean. Agricultural techniques, irrigation methods, and technological innovations spread as Greek and Persian cultures mixed. The charge at Gaugamela had economic consequences that lasted for generations. The architectural legacy was also significant. Alexander founded cities throughout his conquered territories, many following Greek urban planning principles. These cities became centres of Hellenistic culture, spreading Greek language and customs across Asia. The famous Library of Alexandria, one of the ancient world's greatest intellectual institutions, was a direct result of the connections between Greece and Egypt forged by Alexander's conquests. Gaugamela made all of this possible. The military lessons of Gaugamela were studied intensely by later commanders. Roman generals analysed Alexander's tactics and tried to adapt them to Roman legions. They succeeded partially, developing their own cavalry forces, but never quite matched the decisive impact of companion-style charges. Medieval knights studied Alexander and saw themselves as his successors, though their tactical methods differed significantly. Even Napoleon, 2,000 years later, kept a copy of Alexander's campaigns with him and tried to apply Alexandrian principles to modern warfare. The failure of anyone to fully replicate Alexander's success reveals how unique the circumstances at Gaugamela were. Alexander had cavalry trained from childhood. He had officers who understood his intent without detailed orders. He had an army that trusted him absolutely. He faced an enemy with serious command and control limitations. He had perfect timing, striking at exactly the right moment, and he had the personal courage to lead from the front, inspiring his men by example. Replicating all these factors simultaneously proved impossible for subsequent commanders. The companions' victory at Gaugamela represented the peak of ancient cavalry warfare. Never before or after would cavalry achieve such a decisive result against such overwhelming numbers. Later cavalry forces were certainly effective: Roman cavalry, Byzantine cataphracts, medieval knights, Mongol horse archers, but none quite matched the specific achievement of breaking the centre of an army 20 times their size in 15 minutes. It was a perfect storm of training, leadership, timing, and execution that created a result greater than the sum of its parts. The human cost, even in victory, was real. The companions who died in the charge left widows and orphans. Wounded men dealt with disabilities for the rest of their lives. Even the survivors carried psychological scars. Ancient warriors didn't have modern concepts of post-traumatic stress, but they experienced the same symptoms. Veterans of Gaugamela had nightmares, struggled with civilian life, and sought the company of fellow veterans who understood what they had experienced. The glory came at a price. Alexander's death in 323 BCE, just 8 years after Gaugamela, ended the unique period when the companions operated as a cohesive unit. His successors tried to maintain similar cavalry forces, but without Alexander's leadership they never achieved the same effectiveness. The companions fragmented along with Alexander's empire, serving different masters, fighting each other in the wars of succession. The unit that had been the most feared military force in the ancient world disappeared, living on only in historical accounts and military legend. The archaeological evidence from Gaugamela is limited. The exact location of the battle has been debated by scholars. Few physical artifacts survive. But the historical record, preserved in ancient texts, is extensive. Multiple ancient historians recorded the battle, interviewed veterans, and preserved accounts that allow modern scholars to reconstruct events in detail. This historical record ensured that the lessons of Gaugamela would not be lost, that future military thinkers could study and learn from Alexander's methods. The charge at Gaugamela ultimately succeeded because it was the right tactic, executed by the right troops, at the right moment, under the right leadership. Remove any one of those elements, and the result would have been different. Different tactics, a conventional cavalry engagement, would have resulted in stalemate. Different troops, less well-trained cavalry, would have been repulsed. Different timing, charging too early or too late, would have failed. Different leadership, a commander directing from the rear, would have lacked the impact of Alexander's personal presence. Everything had to be perfect, and for those 15 minutes at Gaugamela, everything was. The Persian survivors of Gaugamela carried memories of the charge for the rest of their lives. Greek and Roman historians interviewed Persian veterans decades later, and their accounts consistently emphasized the speed, violence, and shock of the Companion Cavalry breakthrough. They described it as a natural disaster, an earthquake or avalanche, rather than a military maneuver. This was the highest compliment they could pay to the effectiveness of Alexander's tactics. The charge had been so overwhelming that it seemed beyond human capability, like a force of nature that could not be resisted. The legacy of Alexander's cavalry charge at Gaugamela extends into modern military doctrine. The principles he demonstrated, concentration of force, exploitation of enemy weaknesses, maintenance of momentum, decisive action at the critical moment, remain fundamental to military strategy. Tank commanders study Gaugamela. Aviation tacticians analyze Alexander's methods. Special operations forces examine his approach to decisive strikes. The specific tactics have changed. No one fights with cavalry and lances anymore, but the underlying principles are timeless. In the final analysis, the charge at Gaugamela was more than just a military maneuver. It was the culmination of years of training, planning, and preparation. It was a moment when individual courage, tactical genius, and strategic vision combined to create a result that changed history. 47,000 Macedonians defeated an army of 100,000 Persians because 5,000 horsemen, led by a 25-year-old king, charged at exactly the right place and time and broke the enemy's will to fight. In those 15 minutes, the ancient world changed forever. The Persian Empire, which had stood for 2 centuries, began its final collapse. Alexander became the ruler of Asia, and the Companion Cavalry earned their place as the most effective cavalry force in ancient history. The thunder of their hooves, the impact of their charge, and the decisiveness of their victory echoed through the centuries, influencing how warfare would be conducted for the next 2,000 years.